everyone, my name is Simone Ananda and I'm Summer 2021 Social Impact and Diversity Intern here at RingCentral. Thank you so much for tuning in to episode 2 of the RCause in Conversation series. I'm super excited today to be facilitating such an important candid conversation surrounding the topic of racial inequality. But before we get started, I would love to introduce our special guest today. First, we have Kira Arnold. Kira, would you mind introducing yourself?
Certainly. Hello, everyone. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Kira Arnold. I have been working with RingCentral now for just over 5 years. I am currently on our facilities team out of the Belmont office, and my role is physical security analyst.
Great. Thank you so much, Kira. Next, we have Edward Odom. Edward, would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself?
My name is Edward Odom. Call me Ed. I am a senior solutions engineer. I support the enterprise group, financial services. I've been here at RingCentral since October of last year. So happy to be here.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Kira and Edward are both active members of the Black Employees Employee Resource Group here at RingCentral. Thank you both again so much for joining us today. It's an absolute privilege to have you here with us. Let's jump in. In today's society, the term institutional racism, also known as systemic racism, gets brought into conversations frequently. For those of you who may not be aware, systemic racism is a form of racism that is embedded in the laws and regulations within society and organizations. To start off our conversation, I would love to get your guys' perspective on what systemic racism is and how it manifests in our society. Edward, would you like to kick us off?
Systemic racism, as you said, is embedded in our structures, it's embedded in our procedures, it's embedded in our processes. It creates disparities in a lot of our success indicators. And what I mean by success indicators is what opportunities are given to us as citizens in this country. It's a capitalist society. We all come here for that American dream, if you will. Those that migrate and put a lot of things at risk, leave family, they come here for the American dream. What is it that makes up that American dream? Naturally, the ability to build wealth, to have success. So when I talk about success indicators, I'm talking about things like wealth, what affects us, the criminal justice system, employment, housing, healthcare, politics, education. So what you discover if you really dig down deep into our institution, into our system, we'll see that there's systemic racism that's been historically embedded into all of those systems, into all of those things that affects us as citizens. Now, the racism part naturally leans towards African Americans or Black Americans. So when we talk about systemic racism, we talk about those things embedded in those systems that I just talked about that affects African Americans negatively.
I think Ed gave a really, really great explanation there. But the thing that I would want to add in is also, and you both touched on it, is that when it comes to systemic racism, the racism aspect of it is generally not intentional. That's why it is, systemic as opposed to a different descriptor in front of it. A lot of our current policies, laws, procedures that we use today in 2021, those were established decades ago. And at the time that they were established, there may well have been and likely was intentional negative effects worked into those laws, policies, etc., to negatively affect Black Americans, which in turn also affects other people of color and other marginalized groups as well. But those intentions that were set years and years ago, even though those intentions are not still here necessarily in 2021, they still work the same way. We still see those same negative effects. And that is something that I feel as though we are often battling against, is that people will say, oh, well, how can a law be racist? It's objective. It's not something that's no one is sitting down trying to write a racist law. And For the most part, in 2021, that is true. You can make the argument that that's not true for everyone, but for the most part, that is definitely true. No one is sitting down to write a racist law. However, when we still have laws on the books from decades ago, 100 years ago, even in some circumstances, then we do still see the unintended effects of racism today.
Yes, some people are intentionally racist now. We have different kinds of people. We have those that consider themselves white supremacists. They are definitely intentionally racist. Do we have white supremacists that are embedded in our system? I think yes. I think there are white supremacists in our armed forces. I think there's white supremacists in our police departments. I think there are white supremacists in our government. Okay. That being said, I do understand what you mean. I do when they're sitting writing legislation, it's not necessarily a racist agenda, but I do think it is an agenda heavily favored towards one group of people, if you will. Now, to that end, if you look at everything that's going on now with voting rights and them purposely trying to make it harder for specifically people of color to vote, is that intentional? Yes. So I think there can be an argument made that that is an intentional racist law or legislation that they are making. So in that case, I do think there are some pieces of systemic racism that is very much intentional. But I do get your point, and overall I agree with your point.
We talk about how this systemic racism has been manifested in our society from generations before. Could you maybe elaborate for viewers who are not aware how specifically it has been manifested, so specific examples, as well as how that has affected marginalized populations today?
Again, I think you have to narrow it down to the different institutions. Like I said before, criminal justice system, employment, housing, healthcare, politics, education. Here's some statistics. So Black women are 3 times more often that they will die 3 times more often giving birth than white women. If you look per 100,000 live births, 13 white women would die to 41 Black women, right? So you say, so Ed, what does that have to do with systemic racism? Well, the fact that why do they die? There's several reasons. One is Blacks in general have less access to adequate health care. So when you're talking about access to resources and access to things, a lot of that is because of systemic racism that's baked into these systems. When you talk about Black Americans, African Americans are twice as likely to have less health care or health insurance than white people. Even when you look at the COVID, Black people, they're 17% of the population, but they accounted for about 23% of the deaths of COVID. I mean, I can go on and on. Black and white men. Black men, their mortality, they live up to about 71 years, where white people live up to 76 years.
Right, yeah. Something that just comes off the top of my head is the idea of food deserts. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with what food deserts are, but essentially it's in primarily Black housed neighborhoods. There's no food options around them. Everything around them is fast food. So for example, you'll find a McDonald's, you'll find all these unhealthy fast food chains, yet there's no grocery stores. There's no options for them to be able to shop at.
Yeah, and that's a really great example of one of the ways that systemic racism plays out and affects people today in their daily lives, of just not having access to a grocery store to get fresh fruit and produce and etc. And you might, make the argument of like, okay, so there's not one directly in their neighborhood. I don't have a grocery store in my neighborhood, so I just drive to the next town over. But then, you have to also remember Where are these communities located? Do they have access to, have they been paid enough money for them to own a car? Is there adequate public transportation in their area for them to get to the next city or the next neighborhood over? And oftentimes the answer to that is no. And so that's, why a food desert isn't just that main little location. It's all the infrastructure around it as well. That really goes into it and affects how difficult it is to just get basic resources. And then on the flip side, oftentimes you will hear major grocery chains say like, oh, we don't want to build anything there. One, there might be zoning laws against it, so they can't. And additionally, they might say, oh, well, that's not our typical demographic. So I don't think people would, I don't think that if we build a store there, I don't think people would shop there. But then when you think about like, well, what is your typical demographic? And if your typical demographic tends to be affluent people, then, look at where the rest of your stores are. Are all of your stores only in affluent neighborhoods? Then of course your demographics are going to be affluent people because you're not giving people with less money the opportunity to shop there. And oftentimes you will also see what has typically been a historically Black or brown community when it starts to get gentrified, meaning that developers come in and lots of times many people are kicked out of their homes that they've lived in for years or potentially generations. They'll get kicked out of their homes. They'll start building new housing, luxury housing. They'll start doing new developments. More wealthy people come in, more generally white people come in. And then you start to see those same grocery stores that 5 years ago, 10 years ago, would not build a store there. Now, all of a sudden, they'll build a store there.
Yeah. Kira, would you mind elaborating a little bit more on this notion of them being kicked out? I've heard a lot about gentrification and these new companies coming in and building all these resources, yet the people that have been living there for so long are now unable to live there and essentially being kicked out. So could you maybe go into a little bit more detail on how they're being kicked out and what exactly is going on in this situation?
Sure. Kicked out is maybe a little bit too much of a simple explanation because it kind of implies that people are coming into people's homes and like literally physically removing them and, and that is not what is necessarily happening. When I say kicked out, what I generally mean by that is once people with more affluence start to move in, landlords, developers, they recognize these people have more money and I can get more money if I advertise, if I sell, if I rent to these people instead. And so what you end up seeing a lot of times is if they're in an area without rent control or without as many protections about how much a landlord can raise the rent on a yearly basis, landlords will raise rents astronomically beyond what their tenants would be able to pay ever. Even if they had, if they had additional income, they would never be able to pay this. So when it comes time to renew the lease, the tenant says, I can't renew this lease. I can't afford it. They look around in their same neighborhood and unfortunately it's the same. Every apartment has raised their rent. They can't get a unit in their area at a price that they can afford. So they move. So that's kind of one of the very typical, most common ones. Also, what happens sometimes is that developers for grocery stores, malls, business parks, whatever, decide that, oh, that's a good chunk of land. I'd like to develop there. So they will also, if it is homes, like people own their own homes, they will make offers to buy them out. Or if it's, apartment buildings, the developers will make offers to buy out the landlord. So the landlord sells the building. And then once the landlord has sold the building, they don't own it. These developers can just terminate all the leases, everything. Not necessarily terminate the leases, there's legal agreements, but they don't renew the leases. They wait for everyone to have to move out of the building and then they knock it down and build something different. So those are, two of the ways that people kind of get kicked out. Like I said, kicked out is a much more simplified a version of what's happening. But essentially, people are required to leave because they can no longer afford to be in that area. Or the neighborhood has changed so much that they don't even recognize, where they've lived for the past 30 years, 40 years. So they don't want to be there anymore.
If I can add to that, because those are excellent points, but just to talk about how systemic racism permeates, and that it's a domino effect from each one of these systems to another. So we were just talking about food, and from food we went into gentrification. Well, when you talk about gentrification, now you have to go into the other aspect of systemic racism, which is housing. Because people say, well, why don't they just go to a neighborhood where there is more resources, where there is better food, where there isn't a food desert? But then you have to get into historically why people are in the neighborhoods that they are. First of all, naturally, we have to talk about salaries, and we have to talk about disparities in salaries and disparities in jobs. And then you have to get into people can be homeless, number one, but then the next level up to that is just lacking housing security, being able to guarantee that I can stay in this house, or not having the resources, or having the resources but can't get in that next neighborhood because either a bank won't give you a loan to go into that neighborhood, or the real estate people, they won't even show you particular houses or particular neighborhoods if you're people of color. Redlining, it is very deliberate. They actually had red lines on the map on where African Americans can stay and where they can't go. So all of those things are historical, and to really resolve a lot of these things, you have to understand the history of it and then understand how to deal with it.
Yeah, so along the topic of combating systemic racism, a lot of the times the words equity and equality get thrown around. And I know these two words may sound similar, but they actually have very, very different meanings. Would you guys mind sharing the difference between equality and equity, along with what they mean in terms of racial equality versus racial equity?
Kira, you mind if I jump in?
Sure, go for it.
This is one of those that's kind of always been a sore spot to me. Because we talk about equality all the time, you know, when we talk about racism, when we talk about, separate but equal, those kinds of things. So equality just means that every individual or that group is given the same resources or opportunities. That's equality, right? I have the same access you do. I have the same access to the same resources that you do. Equity recognizes that each person has a different circumstance. Allocating the same resources and opportunities, you may need to allocate those resources differently to have an equal outcome. I look at it like this. I have a 6-foot fence, and I'm giving two people opportunity to look over that fence. One person is 6'2", and the other person is 5'8", but it's a 6-foot fence. So the 6'2" person naturally could just look over the fence. That 5'8" person, they can't. So where does the equity come in? So in order to make it equal, something has to be done to allow that 5'8" person equal access to look over that fence. So a stool might have to be required, a ladder might have to be required to allow that person to get up, to be at an equal sight level so that they can both look over the fence. Here's the issue. Here's where the arguments come in. Some people say, well, it's not the 6'2" person's fault that they're 6'2" and that the other person is 5'8". And that is true. And I really personally don't have an argument against that. It's really up to that 5'8" person to make it happen. So that 5'8" person should go find a stool. They should go find the ladder, right? The problem comes in, though, when someone dug a hole and put that person in that hole. And now because of that hole, they can't see over the fence. So now that was a purposeful obstruction that was put in the way of that person looking over the fence. So because I can be 6'2" just like the other person, but if you put me in a hole, now I'm lower than the fence. So equity means that before we can even get to the point of both people looking over that fence, Any obstruction that was put in that person's way has to be addressed. So because that person didn't build the hole, didn't dig the hole, let's say the person in charge of the fence did. Well, if that person that's in that next yard that's given the equal access to these two people, well, if they want to really provide equal access, and they're the ones that dug that hole, they need to fill the hole in first. After you fill the hole in, that 5'8" person, they'll figure it out from that point. But you have to fill the hole in first because you created the hole. And honestly, to me, that's what we all are in America now.
Bear with me for a couple minutes, but I'm going to extend the fence metaphor because I know exactly what image you're talking about, Edward. And so I was going to bring that up as well. The first part that I will say is that everything that you've said is 100% correct in regards to the fence metaphor. But another thing I have seen an additional pane get added to that series of images. And on the third image, it has everyone standing next to each other on the ground at their varying heights, but the fence has been removed. And I think that is actually a really great place to begin thinking about some of these things. There are many things in the world that do have natural barriers and natural obstacles. That's 100% true. However, there's a lot of things, especially in our current system, anyone who's ever had to fill out government paperwork knows this, that it's incredibly difficult. There's a lot of just stuff you need to go back and forth on. It's difficult. A regular person generally needs help doing this, unless you have like a law degree or something, so there are a lot of needless barriers in the world. And so I think a good place for a lot of us to start is, instead of trying to help people get around the barrier, start with thinking, is this barrier necessary? Sometimes the answer will be yes. Sometimes it will be yes. But I think it will surprise us how often the answer is no. To your point as well, Ed, you said, this person who is 6'2" is 6'2", and the person who's 5'8" is 5'8", naturally. That's true as well. However, I would want to also think, you said the 6'2" person can't help being 6'2", and they can't. And why should they? They got to be 6'2". That's tall. Good for them. However, let's not discount the things that helped them grow to 6'2". Did they have access to good health care as a child? Did they have access to good health care continuing on through their teenage growth spurt years? Did they have access to nutritional food that's, important during their developing years that really truly sets you up for to being able to reach your true physical potential in that way? Not to say that this 6'2" person should feel bad or feel guilty for being 6'2". That's not the point at all. But the point is for the 6'2" person to take a step back and think about what in my life helped me become 6'2". That doesn't mean that, height isn't a great example for working hard, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you have not worked hard to get to where you are. It doesn't mean that you are undeserving of it, but it is beneficial to step back and think to yourself, what benefits, what privileges helped me along my path here? And that's a thing that almost anyone can do about various parts of their lives.
Kira, great points. And I think, let's be real also. We've always had to fight the barriers that was put in front of us. When it came to Civil War, when it came to slavery, then we got the Civil War, and that took that slavery barrier from us. And then we started to excel. If you look at Reconstruction, we started putting people in Congress. We started owning our own business. We started generating wealth. And what happens? All right, great compromise come, and then all that stripped away from us. Jim Crow comes, and all of a sudden we have all of these things that's oppressing us. And that's happened every time. If you look through history, even once we got into the 60s and got the Civil Rights Act, then here comes Nixon with his war on crime and all the things that came with that. and not just Nixon, Reagan, Clinton, and sorry to say it, even Biden back then had a hand in it. So we've always had to fight barriers that was put in front of us. A lot of the barriers that put in place, one has to do with plain old competition, where people don't want to compete. They don't want to compete against another group, so they put it in place. But another part has to do with attitude, that this country was built on the foundation of black people supposed to stay in their place. And if we get out of our place, that's what lynching is about. Honestly, it's still around. What do you think police brutality is about? Police brutality is about keeping us in our place, right? So all of those has to do with systemic racism.
As we have discussed today, society/some workplaces are not nearly as equitable as they need to be. How can someone interested in getting involved help to contribute to a more equitable society and workplace?
So sometimes it's just as simple as signing a petition, put your name down. Sometimes it's a matter of picking up the phone and calling your local senator, calling your local congressman, your local council person, because why? You saw something that's not right that needs to be corrected. I don't think, and in my opinion, there's no excuse to do nothing. Some people have more access and more capabilities to do things. I'm part of the Brooklyn chapter of NAACP, and there's different things that we do. And some people may call it old school, but it's still things that we do. There's different organizations that you can join, even if it's not the NAACP. There are different kinds of organizations all over the place. If you don't have time for organizations, that's when you just pick up a phone. Do something. That's my point.
Right, so don't just sit back and watch, actually to actively take the steps to get involved and make change. Thank you. Kira, do you have anything to add?
I would echo everything that Ed just said. Definitely, we can all get involved to some extent. You can get involved really locally. If you don't think that, you're not going to be the person testifying, to Congress about something, that's totally fine. Most of us will never be in a situation where that's a possibility. But, taking part in your local elections, don't just vote every 4 years, vote every year. Cities and towns are holding elections all the time. And those local politicians really are the ones who make the biggest impact in your community's day to day. So paying attention to things like that, getting involved at the local level if it's too hard to follow on the national level, because there's so much going on. America is a huge country and there's so much happening all the time. We've got 50 states with their own governments. It's a lot to follow. And I think sometimes people get a little bit of kind of paralysis when they feel as though they need to be following everything and paying attention to everything and feeling as though they need to be a champion of every single cause. This is something I recognize that I start to feel in myself every now and then. I get overwhelmed with too much going on, and I recognize and I start to realize, I'm not actually doing anything about all of these problems that I'm making sure I know about, but I'm not doing anything about them. And so when I realize that, I'm like, okay, I can step back, don't pay attention as much to the news for the next few weeks. Think about what I'm going to do in my day-to-day in my local community that can actually have a tangible effect. And that way you can see those effects much more clearly as well. As voting every 4 years in national elections, you might, besides the president, you might not really see the effect of those things that you voted for. But you might see the effect of your of involvement in your community within a couple weeks, within a month, within 6 months to a year. Your community in some way could be fully transformed in some aspect. So if you're interested in getting involved but not sure where to start, I would say look around you as opposed to looking nationally.
And if I can, Kira, you just hit on so many things there, because the key there, vote, right? But also don't get distracted, because you were talking about sometimes, we have paralysis through analysis because we're thinking about things, but then we also get caught up in the minutia. So don't get distracted. Don't get caught up. Just the simplest thing is to vote. Vote every opportunity. Vote locally. Vote nationally. And another point to Kira, you may not see the results right away. There's some people that did things in the 20s and 30s that end up dying that never saw the results that started happening in the 50s and the 60s. But their actions was just as important as all the people that came after them to make it happen. So you may not, what did King say? I'm on the mountaintop. I'm looking over into the promised land. I may not get there with you. I may not even see the results of it, but I'm doing my part. I'm working. And that's the attitude that we need to have if change is going to happen, that each one of us have to do our part.
Great. Thank you so much, Kira and Edward, for being so willing to have such an open and honest conversation with us this afternoon. Here at RingCentral, we really aim to honor everyone's unique backgrounds, identities, ethnicities, and perspectives. In doing so, we feel that it's extremely important to have conversations like the ones we had today. This has been RCause in Conversation, episode 2. Thank you so much for watching. We look forward to seeing you in the next episode. Stay safe. Thanks, everyone.